Well, good morning, First Congregational Church, and good morning, community of Langsburg. I am Dr. Tom, pastor of church in town there, and it is good to have you with us on this Sunday morning for our online service. If you've stumbled upon this for your first time, I just wanted to say that this is a church for those who have been shut in or shut out. You know, you got some kind of disability or some kind of a sickness issue, or just can't get around like you used to, and you need access to a church service. This is for you. If you've been shut out, you've been disenchanted, you got doubts, and you just can't find a church home that suits you, this is definitely a church for you. If you're overburdened with schedules and to-do lists and all that kind of stuff, and you don't know how to fit a whole hour church service in your day at a specific slot, this is a church for you. And if you're overstressed and you just are exhausted and need to rest, and you can't get everything together on a Sunday morning to get anywhere, then this is a church for you. So that's what we're about, and we're church for you, we're church for me, for church for us. And today we actually start a brand new series in John chapter 6. We're gonna stay there for the next few weeks, and we're gonna call this series Bread and Water. And we're looking at John chapter 6 and how Jesus is talking about the essentials of life. What are the essentials, and how does faith fit into all of this? And today's passage is a really interesting one, where Jesus actually feeds 5,000 people and then walks on water. Really dramatic, amazing miracle. We're going to explore and see what God has for us today in this. So first off, we have a call to worship. It is a psalm that has been rewritten by Malcolm Guite, modern day poet, and Pat has read it for us. And then we're going to hear today's passage of scripture read by Eugene, and then we shall explore what this passage means for us.
When heaven's hidden gates are drawn apart and our captivity is ended, we'll rejoice. But now the fool's in charge, and in his heart he only echoes his own emptiness. No God, no vestiges of reverence disturb his vanity, just weariness and mockery, just cruel insolence and greed that still consumes the poor like bread. These only seem to move him. Violence is like a drug to him. He cocks his head and speaks his poison words with hissing tongue. And yet, we still believe him. Let him dread the day that's coming. It will not be long. The poor have cried, and now they have been heard. The fool will fall before their joyful song. This is Psalm 14. Retold by Malcolm Guite.
So a long time ago now, I became one of the pastors at a rural church here in Michigan. And we're talking rural, not small town, we're talking rural like no town. There was like a post office, and that was about it. And it was a church in the middle of a cornfield, and people wore like camouflage to church. It was very rural, and here I come as one of the pastors. I grew up on 8 Mile and Grand River, right outside the city line of Detroit. I'm a city boy. I didn't know how to do it, but I was really enjoying the rural atmosphere and way of life and learning it. But I didn't own a shred of camo. I didn't own any kind of hunting material, and this was a church where camouflage was worn on Sundays, kind of a deal. And it was interesting. And one of my friends of this church invited me to the National Wild Turkey Federation banquet for Ionia County. And he was kind of the overseer of it, and he asked me to give the prayer invocation at this thing. And I showed up at the banquet, and it was quite interesting. I did not feel like I just kind of sunk into place here. I didn't really understand the culture of what was going on. And I gave the invocational prayer at the beginning. Everyone started eating, and then the auction took place. You know, the auction, they're auctioning off gear, they're auctioning off hunts. It's like special hunts on different continents and whatnot. They're auctioning off different items. There's raffles, there's door prizes, and everyone's really into this stuff. And, you know, they're bidding on exorbitant amounts of money on these big hunts, and I could see why it was a fundraiser banquet. They were raising the funds, if you know what I'm saying. And here I am, city boy, not a hunter, no camouflage. I'm a pastor. I barely make any money. I can't, auction. I can't bid on any of the auctions. Just feeling really out of place. Like I don't belong here. I'm not here. And at the end of this whole banquet, just kind of sealed the deal of, man, I was really out of place. They played this compilation video at the end to get everybody fired up for the turkey hunting season that was approaching. And, they have these guitars start coming in, and AC/DC's Thunderstrucks just starts playing over the loudspeaker. And then there's these compilations of turkeys walking around. And every time the chorus comes in and they say the word thunderstruck, they would pair it up with a turkey gobble. Like it was like, ah. And I was just like, I didn't know what to think, because I just figured turkeys were like big chickens. And it was like, I don't understand why this is getting everyone fired up. It's just a bunch of turkeys gobbling on the camera to thunderstruck. I didn't get it. I was not a part of the culture. I didn't feel like I belonged at all. But then I went on my first turkey hunt and I got it. And I was like, oh, now I understand what that video was about. I understand what the gobble was about. I understand a little bit more of what it was about. And I slowly began to enter into this different culture that I didn't know anything about. But it sure felt awkward for quite some time.
John 6, 5 through 21. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated, as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus had performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Jesus walks on the water. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading.
Have you ever felt this out of place before? That you show up at an event or amongst people and you feel like the outsider, you feel like the foreigner, you feel like the other, and it creates this like inner anxiety inside of you. Like, do I belong here? Should I belong here? Could I belong here? Do I want to belong here? You show up into these places where you feel like you don't belong. It creates that anxiety that asks these questions. And we can either carve out our own place as I don't belong here, therefore I'm going to be anti-belonging, and we can criticize, squish mosquitoes. We can criticize it, we can be angry about it, we can be defensive about it, or we can try and mirror everything and just kind of blend in and, shadow everything that's going on around us. Those are like 2 different responses that we can have according to this anxiety created with the question, do I belong? Now this question, do I belong, is a part of one of the Psalms that's very important for our passage today. Our passage today, we're supposed to think of Psalm 24 when we think of this passage in John 6. Who may ascend your holy hill? Now, why are we going to ask that? Because the very first thing we notice about this passage is that people are ascending a hill with Jesus. Now, when there's a detail like that communicated in the scriptures, we're supposed to ask, what is this pointing to in previous thoughts, in previous culture of the day? And the previous culture is this Psalm 24, where it says, who may ascend your hill and stand in your holy place? Now, the temple system that they all worshiped at was at the top of a hill. And every year at Passover, they would ascend this hill and go to worship. And Psalm 24 is this question of who can come and worship in God's presence. So this temple is the center for religious activity at the top of a mountain. And here we see Jesus, this housing the Spirit of God, is ascending a hill and people are following. So when we ask this question, who can ascend your hill? And we read John 6 and we see all these crowds ascending this hill to follow Jesus. Right after he gives a verbal lashing to the religious elites called the Pharisees, the answer to this question starts to become a little more clear. Who can ascend the hill and stand in the holy place with God? Well, here is a whole crowd of people standing on a hill with the temple of God housing the Spirit in the person of Jesus. And the question, who may ascend this hill? Well, who's there right now? Who's not there? There are all these religious elites that say, we don't need that guy, he's a loony. And then we have all of these desperate, hungry people that have ascended the hill with Jesus, and they're welcomed up the hill to be with him. Okay, so this big crowd ascends the hill with Jesus, and they are hungry. The disciples are like, how are we going to feed all these people? And somebody says it's going to take a lot of money to feed all these people, like 200 days wage to feed all these people. We just can't do that. So let's send them home so they can go feed themselves. And then some guy is like, hey, there's a boy with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Now, my question, what is a little kid doing with 5 loaves of bread? How many loaves of bread can you eat at one sitting? You can't eat a whole loaf of bread in one sitting. So what's this small little kid doing with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish? That was my question here, because this boy is kind of singled out in this story and brought to the forefront. And what's he doing with 5 loaves of bread? That's a lot of bread for one little boy to have. Even for one whole family to have, it's a lot of loaves of bread. So I started looking into this, and I had that question. And a lot of times when a big crowd would gather, then you would see kids start coming in as street vendors, selling what they could to seize the opportunity here. Selling, water, selling bread, selling fish. So this kid, there's a good chance that he is kind of sent by his family to be a street vendor and take advantage of this opportunity of all the crowds coming to Jesus. And he's like, I got a chance to make some money here. I'm going to run and get as many loaves of bread as I could. Barley was the cheapest grain there was. It was for animals and the very poor. It wasn't really a nice grain to have. Animals and very poor. So this is a very poor kid, takes all of his barley left in his storehouse, makes as much bread as he can get, and then goes to sell it all. So this kid is probably the street vendor trying to seize opportunity that comes from being desperate because you have no capabilities to provide for yourself. He's poor. So this boy answers the question, who can ascend the hill and stand in the holy place? The very hungry and the very desperate. Those are the people that that Jesus is trying to highlight as having a place to come and be filled and be fed. Folks who are desperate enough to follow this stranger into the wilderness, that they didn't have food, they didn't bring enough food for some reason. They're following this guy, thinking to themselves, somehow God is here, somehow God provides, somehow this is going to happen. And this boy is really neat because he's the one who's thinking, he's the one who's planning, he's the one who's scheming. And he's like, I'm going to go make some money because that's a big crowd. So he has this desperation that comes from being in a position of poverty. And who can come and stand before God's presence? This little boy is brought out as like a shining example. And they take these loaves and fishes, and then all of a sudden, there's a meal for everybody. All right, so everybody eats enough bread, and there's 12 baskets left over, and everyone's like, wow, that was amazing. He took 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish, and all of these people were able to eat an entire meal out in the wilderness. Okay, so it says here that the people get so excited that they want to seize Jesus, like seize him, grab him, and make him king by force. What's going on here? Like, why is that their initial response? Why is that their first reaction? Well, there's a leader who leads people into the wilderness and then magically feeds them bread of provision, and all of a sudden, does that ring a bell to anybody else? This is Moses being retold here. Moses led the people of Israel into the wilderness. Manna rains from heaven, which is a kind of a honey bread, and they eat, and it was a sign of God's provision and a sign of God's presence and favor with this leader Moses. And Moses says in Deuteronomy 8 that another leader is going to rise up like me to take my place one day. And everyone's waiting for that person. And here it is Jesus. I led this group into the wilderness, fed them bread. I am claiming, yes, I'm the Deuteronomy 8:3 king who's come to lead you into the new promised land. Now what they want to do is seize Jesus and make him king by force. But they've already made this mistake in their history when they rejected Samuel and chose Saul. Back in their history, they chose Saul, the king, and God says to Samuel, who was the prophet at the time, they want a king like all the other nations. They want to act like all the other nations. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. So they want to take Jesus and seize him and make him king, just like they did back in the days of Samuel. And Jesus knows that I can't become king like this. I can't seize authority like this. I have to reject becoming a king on earth's terms because it comes with too much fine print, and there's not enough room to start setting the table of inclusion broad. Because if I accept being a king on earth's terms, that means only certain few rise to power and oppress everybody else. And Jesus says, that's not the way I'm going to become king. I'm going to become king on God's terms through love and sacrifice. And we see it in Jesus' passion, in his trip to the cross, his death on the cross, his burial into the grave, and then his resurrection and ascension to the highest place in all of creation, right hand of God. So we see this becoming king on God's terms versus becoming king on humans' terms. And this is where we make our greatest mistakes as humanity, is we seize people to make them kings on earth's terms, on the terms of dominion, violence, and power, instead of the terms of love and violence and self-sacrifice. Love and nonviolence and self-sacrifice. And that's where we go wrong. And Jesus says, I can't become king with all of these fine prints of who's going to be benefiting and who's going to be oppressed and who's going to be left out. He says, I'm setting the table broad, I'm setting the table wide. And that he has to run up the hill to get away from everybody because they want him to be king so bad, because they want to have more power for themselves. So what happens next? Jesus takes off for the hills. The disciples go down in the boat to wait for him on the shore. What happens? So the disciples went down to the boat to wait for Jesus, which is how they arrived here in the first place. Jesus has retreated up the hill to get away from the crowds that want to make him king. What happens? It starts to get dark. It starts to get late. What do the disciples do? They sit and faithfully wait for Jesus. Nope, they don't do that, right? We've already read this passage. That is not what they do. They do the opposite. Jesus ain't coming. I guess we better leave without him. So they get in the boat and they leave without Jesus. The disciples abandon their rabbi, their teacher, their leader. They totally abandon him and go out for the water. And it says it gets very dark. And then a gale storm comes, and they're rowing, and the wind is up, and they can't get out of it. And then all of a sudden, Jesus comes down into the back out of the hills, starts walking across the water. They think he's a ghost. They're freaking out. And he says, you know, it is me. It's I'm here. There's a lot to that phrase that we can't look at today, but he says, it's me. And then they're like, oh, it's Jesus. They get him in the boat, and then like that, they are at their destination. Like, I don't know if they had like one of those Star Trek warp machines that just kind of like transferred them over there. I don't know how it happened, but in this story, this is how it goes. Jesus gets in the boat, and then it says immediately they were just at the destination. Boom, like that. Now, it's very easy to look at this passage and say, boy, those disciples are losers. Boy, they just left when Jesus was up on the hill. They just took off, and you're like, yeah, it's getting dark. We got to go. It's really easy to make the disciples the subject and Jesus this object that they have abandoned. But we need to reverse that, because the disciples are not supposed to be the subject of this passage. They're the object of God pursuing them on top of the water. So yes, they have abandoned their rabbi, their teacher, their friend, Jesus, and they're out on the water. But the passage is not supposed to be highlighting the abandonment of the disciples. The passage's main emphasis is on the pursuit of God after these disciples at all costs. He's walking on stinking water to get back to the people that abandoned him. This is supposed to highlight the immense pursuit of God in loving pursuit of us. That it doesn't matter how crappy we have been that day, or previous life history and all this stuff. God is just radically pursuing us. He's moving heaven and earth to come after us. And if we ever feel like losers because we're just not faithful enough, we're not good enough, we can't do it enough, we're never enough, I don't belong here, I don't belong among God's people, I can't ascend God's hill and stand in this holy place. We're ever feeling that way, we've made ourselves the subject, God is the object. And what we need to do is kind of reverse that and say, God is the subject. Look at the goodness of God. Look at the love of God that pursues us against everything. Walking on the stinking water, for Pete's sake. Like, the intense love of God in pursuit of us is the subject of this, and we are the object receiving God's kindness and mercy and love. We got to reverse this around to give it in perspective. This is about God. This is not about us. This is about God's faithfulness and goodness, not about our unfaithfulness or inability to be good. It's not about that. Who can ascend your hill? Who can ascend and stand in your holy place? Those who are desperate, those who are hungry, that's all it takes. That's all you need, is desperation and hunger to stand in God's presence, because it doesn't matter how faithful we can be or not be. It's about just receiving this pursuit of God and saying, I'm caught. Okay, so what if all of your rowing, all of your working, all of your fighting the winds and the waves all around you is to find acceptance, to find your place, to find your belonging, is actually totally useless, because your being, your existing is enough. What if your existence is your invitation to be here in this world, and not you have to do and accomplish and become all of this in order to secure a valuable place in this world? What if just the mere fact that you exist and breathe oxygen on planet Earth is enough to bring you value and belonging among God's people? What if you were not an uninvited guest here on this earth, but you're a welcome participant in life with God? You know, what if our communities began with the assumptions you belong when people showed up at our doors, when people showed up on our internet doorsteps, right? The automatic assumption is, oh, you're a human and you breathe and you belong. You have value. You have something to contribute. And instead of looking at them with a little bit of a side glance saying, what do you got? How are you going to contribute to this or that? Or what if there was enough bread for everybody to go around in this wilderness of life? We didn't have to fight for it and hoard it and, you know, try and get our 5 loaves and try and, what if all we needed to stand before God was desperate hunger for everything that is good and true and beautiful and authentic in this world? What if that hunger was enough? What if that was all that we needed? I love this Thomas Merton line, and I'll leave you with this one. It says, this was his prayer to God. He said, "Oh, how far I have to go to find you, God, in whom I have already arrived." What if that search is life's work, but it's discovery of our already belongingness in the presence of God?
Poem this morning called "And the Table Will Be Wide." And the table will be wide, and the welcome will be wide, and the arms will open wide to gather us in, and the hearts will open wide to receive. And we will come as children who trust there is enough, and we will come unhindered and free, and our aching will be met with bread, and our sorrow will be met with wine. And we will open our hands to the feast without shame, and we will turn toward each other without fear, and we will give up our appetite for despair, and we will taste and know of delight, and we will become bread for a hungering world, and we will become drink for those who thirst, and the blessed will become the blessing, and everywhere will be the feast. By Jan Richardson.
I had to run away from a weed eater. It was getting loud, but I retreated to the cornfield. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today for our online service. If you want to partner with us financially, there's a link down here on the bottom of your screen. You can type that in up there and give a one-time or become a recurring donor to keep this internet service going. We want to be a place of hope, help, and healing for our community and out into the internet worlds. If you want to participate with us, not just partner with us, but participate, you want to do any of our readings or recordings, it's real easy. You just record yourself with your phone. It's all I'm doing. So I got my phone. I'm recording right now. You just do a little recording, send it in, and it's quite easy. Hey, next week we have Bread and Water Part 2. We're going to dive into a little bit more of what John 6 has for us today. We're going to stay in this John 6 passage for a little while and see what God has for us in this last season of summer that we're in. So we'll see you next week. You have an awesome time, and thanks for joining us today. I had cat hair on me. You. Okay, part 4.